We do not have governments acting with empathy to other species. And until we have the Australian government, the Victorian government and every other state government agreeing that this is a national priority, that we will make unprecedented levels of investment into solving, then we are nowhere. This incredibly intelligent and complicated diagram is my solution to the universe. The yellow box up there that you can barely read is basically a Council of Australian Governments agreement amongst all Australian governments that we are going to get serious about protecting our biodiversity and our ecosystems. We need to establish a biodiversity and climate change fund to resource the action that Will's described and Vic Naturally are promoting. We need to give ecosystem service markets the opportunity to provide private landholders and others with the economic incentive to do and reward to do the right thing. And finally, in the yellow box on the far right there that you can see, we need governments held to account, not for shooting off hot air, but for delivering what they promised to deliver. In my view, if the federal government leads this process, they need to ensure that state governments, when they deliver the outcomes that we want, protect our biodiversity, they get an elephant stamp and they get some money. But they don't get an elephant stamp and money until you deliver what you promise. In my simple sense, that's a fairly straightforward way to go about it. So I can see the scepticism in the audience. Well, yes, shiny ass greenie, how are you going to pay for all these great ideas? Well, I'm glad you ask. Rather than giving $18 billion to some of Australia's big greenhouse gas polluters, as is currently proposed under the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, why don't we use that money for something else? Let's take 10% of it and put it into that climate change and biodiversity fund. That would be a start. That would give us a couple of $2 billion each year. Next thing we could do would be phase out fuel tax credits. That's another $1 to $3 billion. Then we could have a jig around in the fringe benefits tax for company cars. Get rid of the incentives that actually reward people for driving more. There's another $186 million. The money is there if we decide to change our priorities. We need to acknowledge that our natural life support systems can be a part of the solution to climate change and not just its victim. CSIRO and the Wentworth Group have estimated that there's about 1,000 million tonnes of carbon that could be stored in our natural landscapes over the next 40 to 50 years. So the carbon that Elvis Presley put up into the atmosphere flying from Memphis to Chicago, it's still sitting up there, and the only thing that can draw it down are our natural ecosystems. And if we have healthy ecosystems, it can store that carbon, for a long period of time. There are many uncertainties about the ability of landscapes to draw down carbon. And the downside is landscapes, like during bushfires, emit large amounts of carbon dioxide as well. But we know that the relationships, the connections between soil, vegetation, water, biodiversity increases the power of the landscape to draw down that legacy of pollution that Elvis, that your mothers and fathers put up into the atmosphere and that you'll put up tomorrow. Now, it's not the whole solution. Tony Abbott says that the only way to go forward is to, have the magic of soil carbon. If you have a look on the far left there, basically the long yellow line is emissions from stationary energy. 78% comes from stationary energy of our emissions. If we want to walk, we need two legs. We need to reduce industrial emissions, and we need to harness the power of nature to draw down and store carbon. The two have to work together if we want to walk. A good start would be governments making decisions in the interests of the environment to actually start valuing the ecosystem service benefits of looking after biodiversity, carbon and water in our public lands. If we just look at the Goulburn River, for example, the wet forests of the Goulburn River, work the ACF has done has calculated that if we stopped chopping down the trees there, over the next 100 years we could gather another 3,800 billion litres of water. That's worth a lot of money. That we could draw down carbon from the atmosphere that would help us get 21,000 cars off the road. In my view, that's the right thing to do. So what's stopping us doing it? A $12 million restructuring package, less than what we spend on the Grand Prix each year. We need to make our natural life support system part of the climate change solution, not just its victim. And there are landholders right around the country who are already trying to do it. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to some landholders up at the back of Cairns who are trying to aggregate the carbon on their farms. All that means is if they've got 50 farmers who might have between 1 and 6 tonnes of carbon being sequestered in their regrowth or biodiverse plantings that they're putting along their river frontages, they combine all the carbon from the little farms into a big bit of carbon. Now that's important because what it allows them to do, hopefully, will be to sell that carbon into the market so that the farmer who has revegetated their river frontage will receive a payment for the 6 tonnes of carbon that is sequestered in their trees. But importantly, what they also do is not be greedy. They don't just want the upside, they don't just want the benefit from the carbon sequestration, they realise that that carbon from those trees might be emitted into the atmosphere if they're chopped down or if they're burnt. So what they do is put a percentage of their annual revenue from the sale of carbon permits into an insurance fund. So if there are emissions from that vegetation, they can pay for it. They want to account for the upside of looking after the country and the downside. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. Fantastic visions like Habitat 141 that bring together the management of public lands on one hand and provide incentives for landholders and non-government organisations on the other are already in existence. But what they need, at the moment they're like a green car without a motor. Right? They need investment, they need government backing and energy to make this stuff work. They need it to be a national priority, just as important as having good hospitals and schools. The other important thing that we can do is strengthen our national reserve system, which is a jargonistic way of talking about our national parks and other sorts of protected areas. We need to remember that land and water are connected things and look after them together. And I'll give you one tangible example. Last year, the federal government bought a property called Tarali on the Warrego River that runs into the Darling River, and then the Darling River runs into the Murray, and then the Murray runs out to the sea. Now, they bought water up on the Warrego River, and they bought a property which is in one of the really key bioregions of Australia that's doing pretty well. Now, what a fantastic thing that happened late last year was, through some, I think it's called creative accounting, the water that was bought on the Warrego River was used to put into this beautiful wetland, Little Hattah, up on the Murray, just out of Mildura. So by considered management of land and water, what we have is, rather than an ecosystem being wound down, we're giving it a chance, we're giving it the space to adapt to the new world that's breaking upon us. So, we get back to the one good man, the one good woman, and that act of generosity, driven, I believe, by empathy. Unless we can convince our governments to act with empathy, with generosity to other species, we are nowhere. But I think that those values, that moral purpose is fundamental to the health of our democracy and to the way each of us live our lives. And I think that if you and I are active in drawing these attentions through our one vote, through our $1, through the one drop of water that we could return to a river, that we will make a difference and that we will give our beautiful country the chance to adapt and flourish under the new world that is coming for us. Thanks for listening, and thank you very much.